So each panelist has been asked to prepare a 15-minute presentation, and then the Q&A will start shortly after all the presenters have spoken. Our first presenters are Ria Bose and Liesl Theron. Ria Bose is a research scholar in the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, where she is currently pursuing her MPhil in Women's Studies after having completed her master's degree in Gender Studies from Ambedkar University in New Delhi. Her current research work focuses on the coexistence of digital spaces and queer identities. And Asmita Kundu is a research scholar in Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi and is currently pursuing her PhD in English Studies. Her dissertation is The Evolution and Ambiguities of Secularism in India, a study of novels in India from the mid-19th century to the early 21st century. She has also completed her MPhil in English Studies. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Asmita, and that is my co-presenter Ria. We will be splitting our presentation. I will be talking about the first half, and Ria will take over the second half. Both of us go by she and her pronouns. The title of our paper is The Politics of Time, Nationality, and Identity in the Writings of Lesbian Histories in India. Our paper talks about the various politics that surrounds the questions of the lesbian history writing in India with respect to specifically three texts: Sakhyani by Giti Thadani, Queer Activism in India by Nesari Dave, and Loving Women by Maya Sharma. Now, any act of queer history is embedded with some various polemics and political concerns. On one hand, it has to embark in the process of retrieving traces of existences which has been thus far denied languages from history. And on the other hand, it has to critique history itself as it exists to illuminate the cis heterocentric notions that has thus far obliterated the recording of queer lives. Now, lesbian history, specifically in the context of India, have some added responsibilities. Firstly, it has to establish a cohesive historical legitimacy outside of the parameters of the narratives already dominated by Western or colonial fixtures. It has to continuously negotiate with the invisibilizations that come with the category of the lesbian itself within the domain of queer history. And lastly, it has to question the limits of a nationalistic belonging while writing a lesbian history from a country like India that is currently and has always faced the dangers of a right-wing nationalist uprising. Our first text, Giti Thadani's Sakhyani, Lesbian Desire in Ancient and Modern India, is a project that wants to situate lesbian desire as historical truths that existed across time in India. But she does it not just rather by uncritically celebrating the bare minimum presence of anything that can be considered queer, but she focuses more on the heterocentric discourses, which she says has systematically destroyed, and I quote, the gynophobal traditions which had once legitimized lesbian desire. Now, during the late 90s and the early 2000s in India, like Thadani, many other queer scholars who would want to write anything about pertaining to queer history in general was faced with a scarcity of any kind of archival validity which would substantiate their work. Regarding this, Ashwini Sukthankar, who is the editor of another lesbian Indian anthology named Facing the Mirror, says that the act of writing a lesbian history often becomes like, and I quote, walking along the cliff of an edge without a map. What Thadani does is continuously point out that since ancient India started to encounter a more formalized form of Hinduism, many indigenous and independent traditions, which had tendencies that occasionally gave voice to lesbian desires, became more and more subsumed under one heteronormative and monolithic masculine presentation of history. Her research suggests that many presences, even in the form of stories, folklores, temple architectures, or even texts, became deliberately invisibilized with a heterosexual narrative. For example, many temples in India, like the Tara Tarini temple in Orissa, India, originally possessed the iconographies of the twin lesbian goddesses, which got later replaced by heterosexual images. She says that it is, and I quote, the deep misogyny and fear of the independent feminine at all levels is one of the major reasons that has led to the subsequent silencing of lesbianism in India. Now, while talking about modern India during the colonial times, she talks about how the nationalistic and mainly Hindu nationalist response against the colonizers to create a motherland out of a nation gave very problematic and paradoxical images of womanhood in itself, where it came with this like paradoxical duality of on one hand womanhood being only expressed through a very desexualized lens of motherhood, on the other hand the rhetoric of the same was accompanied with a very over sexualized from an over sexualized male perspective. Thadani points out how many hyper-visible aspects of Indian religious and cultural traditions once had lesbian roots that are now completely invalidated by heterosexual narratives. For example, the popular Hindu celebration of the love between the gods Radha and Krishna had earlier roots of lesbian eroticism and love between Radha and her Sakhis, Sakhi being the Sanskrit word for female to female friendship or a female friend in general, that got completely overpowered by placing Krishna as the sole male propagator of love. The existence of the cult Sakhi Bhavas, which was a cult of devotees of Radha, tried reclaiming the tradition of celebrating this female to female bonding and eroticism, but that also later got subsumed under one monolithic, largely heterosexual image of Hinduism, and later on during the colonial times faced appropriation due to Catholic converts. Sakhyani also lists clauses from ancient Indian scriptures which provided concrete instances of homophobia, especially towards the lesbians. For example, a widely known Hindu social legal text of ancient India, Manu Smriti, or the Laws of Manu, has the following clauses. You can see them on the screen. One of them being a kanya who does it to another kanya being the Sanskrit word for a young woman, and what they're referring to is any kind of sexual act, must be fined 200 pannas, paid the double of the bride price, and received 10 lashes of the rod. All these instances are quoted by Thadani to show how lesbianism underwent deliberate censorship throughout Indian history. Later on, as the tradition progressed and became more and more codified, with the constant consolidation of a religion like Hinduism, even such phrases of caution became vaguer. Any mention of lesbianism was further suppressed because it was thought that female sexuality has been successfully controlled. Thadani's book sheds light on the structural lesbophobia that existed throughout Indian history, and that in itself should be a necessary step while arriving at the possibility of writing a lesbian history in India at all. Thadani's stances can sometimes be thought of as slightly contradicting the overarching claims made by some of other queer Indian scholars. For example, like most Indian scholars believe that it is the ushering in of colonization that brought in the major strains of homophobia in India. And like, for example, one scholar named Ruth Vanita in her work, Homosexuality and Hinduism, says that there have been irrefutable evidences of homosexuality in the past in Indian Hindu and Islamic texts, but it was due to the ushering in of Victorian moralities that they got completely overpowered, and what was once a minor homophobic trend became a dominant one in modern India. While Thadani acknowledges the impact of the influences of Victorian morality vis-a-vis colonization, her book is also a testament as to how there have been conscious structural efforts to silence lesbianism throughout its history. Arguments like that of Vanita's largely rely on proving that Indian culture has always been more accommodating against Western culture in terms of homosexuality, because of the accusations that homosexuality in India is largely a Western construct. But it is, her work can also be read as a discourse where it can only be deemed as a nationalist celebration of Indian culture in itself, and not pointing out the various ways lesbianism fought and resisted throughout Indian history and why it was silenced, as Thadani does. These scholars have also pointed out that this act of quote-unquote recovering the lesbian from the ruins of history should itself invoke some suspicion, as it is often accompanied by forms of power that remain hidden. In this aspect, one scholar named Jose Munoz, in his book Ephemera versus Evidence, says that such an act of retrieval can often do more harm than good because it lays bare queer lives to further attacks. And we should always focus more on the fact that queer history is transferred covertly as more like innuendo, gossip, fleeting moments, and performances. Another scholar, Anjali Arundekar, in her book of the record, also cautions us against relying too much on, and I quote, triumphant forms of empiricism to and insists on, like in the while writing a queer or a feminist history, insists on resisting the titillations of the very history that had once suppressed it. Thadanis Sakyani, in challenging the lesbophobic tendencies across Indian history, can be said to have done justice to these very challenges proposed by queer history. Now, I would want my co-presenter to uh, take over and talk over the next section of the video.
Hello everyone. I'll be talking about two books. One is Nesagi Dave's book Queer Activism in India, and the second is Loving Women, Being Lesbian in Unprivileged India, which is written by Maya Sharma. So both these texts I've placed and read them alongside each other because they both are examples of modern forms of historical recovery. So before I go on to looking at certain aspects that both these texts talk about, I will first give a brief comment on the nature of their works. So Nesargi Dave's work, in her work, she traces the everyday negotiations done by early queer organizations in the 2000s with respect to the manner in which they deliberated over the imagination and the articulation of lesbian politics in their specific ways. The category of affect in understanding lesbian desire is central to her work, where she observes various kinds of foreclosures that had to take place within the realm of queer activism. About Maya Sharma's book, it's more of an ethnographic study of locating lesbian desire in rural and working class communities in India in an attempt to decenter queerness from its predominantly urban privileged locations. I'll take up the category of lesbian and how it has been talked by Dave and how it has been looked at by Dave and Sharma in their respective books. So when we talk about Dave, she takes the idea, the figure of the lesbian, and how it has been dealt by various organizations, how they engaged with this particular figure. She talks about two organizations first. One is Sangini, and one is Jagori. So both these organizations had carefully tried to distance themselves from the term lesbian, and there were various rationalities that she understands in this particular process. For a lot of people within Sangini and Jagori, a need for a cultural authentic term in as a substitute for lesbianism was understood as more prudent if the lesbian was to be made intelligible to the larger audience in India. At the same time, this also needs to be located within the rationalities that were there with respect to the women's movement. The women's movement back then was very hesitant to talk about issues around sexuality in very direct terms, and maybe talking about it, but not really talking about the term lesbian was something that was also understood by them as a logical move towards doing something like that. Second is the the organization Sakhi. Now, Sakhi had a different trajectory in Dave's book. As noted in Dave's book, she talks about how Sakhi really embraced the category of the lesbian in their articulation of lesbian politics. But here again, she points out how the transnational fame that Sakhi got after it became, people got to know about this organization, and the funding that it got as a result of that kind of led to different foreclosures that emerged within the organization, where they were also hesitant to deal with very excessive forms of eroticism in their articulation of lesbian. While retaining the figure of the lesbian, they wanted to talk about it in proper political ways, which would mean that you manage the idea of element of eroticism within that. Dave also takes up the lesbian the idea of lesbian identification with respect to personal identification. She talks about two members of Sakhi whose names are Betu and Veronica. Both the people were queer and queer from a very early age in their childhood, but they never really identified with the word queer. They never thought of themselves as lesbian. She talks about it in terms of the process of lesbian as being as an act of becoming, where they were brought into where when they came into the organization, they participated in different kinds of activities, which included watching movies and talking about lesbian sexuality, after which they slowly started to identify with the category. Here she tries to make a distinction between interpellation as opposed to becoming a homosexual voluntarily. And she talks about how the act of becoming a homosexual needs to take account of the process itself rather than just understanding it as interpellation. The second book that the second book that I'm talking about is Maya Sharma's book on a lesbian, where she talks about the idea of the lesbian, and she talks about the dilemmas around the uses of the term lesbian itself. Uh, as Ashmita also mentioned, there was a lot of historical stigma to the term, but she also underlines why she finds it necessary to talk about this book by using the term lesbian, because she wants to prevent any kind of obfuscation of the category of lesbian. She doesn't want it to slide in the category of female friendships, and she wants to really very concretely locate the figure of the lesbian in this particular context in the rural working class community. That is the intention with which she has done this project, where she understands using the term lesbian as very important. So both the texts also talk about the release of the Hindi movie Fire, which is very crucial to the idea of lesbian politics in India. When Dave talks about it, she talks about it in relation to Shiv Sena, as also Maya Sharma. But Dave brings out two different interesting perspectives, where she says how for a lot of Shiv Sena members, Shiv Sena is a Hindu right-wing organization based in Maharashtra in India. Shiv Sena demanded, after the release of the movie Fire, where they showed two sister-in-laws engaging in sexual activity with each other when they were both dissatisfied with their respective partners. So they say that the female protagonists in the movie, their names were Sita and Radha, and they demand that their names be made to Shabna and Shabana and Saira. And if that were to happen, they would not have any problems with the movie. She talks of the aspect of religion here, where Sita and Radha hold a very particular relevance in the Hindu cultural context, and she takes up and Saira and Shabana had Muslim are predominantly names of people from the Muslim community, and it gives us insight into the aspect of religion in articulation of same-sex sexuality in India. Also, she talks about fire being located in the sphere of domesticity and problematizing the institution of marriage, which itself had its own which is also something she understands as contributing to why the movie became so controversial. Um, uh, uh, yeah. Maya Sharma talks about fire with relation to particular Shiv Sena members and what they had to say, which also points to similar trajectories. I won't go into the detail of this. I'll just go to the last slide now. Yeah. Taking that conversation forward, Dave in her book talks about the fire controversy and how it was followed by a lot of demonstrations where the placard lesbian and Indian was very prominent. And she understands that as to be a very significant affective moment for a lot of Indians who did not, who never thought of it as being commensurable categories, both Indian and lesbian. And this provided a particular moment for some kind of possibility to emerge for the population. And based on that, even Calorie, another lesbian organization, queer organization in India, which brought out its statement "Lesbian Emergence," which and said and demanded that I'm an Indian lesbian and I demand my rights, which has a very particular affective element to it. And she also talks about the necessities of going back to history in order to retrieve the figure of the lesbian, because she says since the exile that lesbians faced was very concrete, and return to the past is almost inevitable. And she points to works like Sakhyani, where turn to the past does not necessarily have to translate into a turn into Hindu majoritarian sensibilities as well. Talking about Maya Sharma's book, she talks about, in terms of nationalism, she tries to situate lesbianism in unprivileged India in order to puncture the national imagination of queer politics and engage with questions around representation, because the queer politics in the national level is often dominated by a very privileged upper caste idea of homosexuality. She also speaks to the women's movement, as mentioned before, where they talk about sexuality and class as binaries, and she wants to locate sexuality in the lower class context in order to trouble the binaries that the women's movement already presumed. Um, yeah, this ends our presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Ria and Asmita. Our next presentation will be from Liesl Theron and Julius K. Kaggwa. Liesl Theron is a freelance consultant and researcher, an activist since 2005. An activist since 2005 when she co-founded and became the inaugural executive director of Gender Dynamics, GDX, the first South African and African registered organization focusing on trans advocacy. 3 recent contributions published include Beyond the Mountain, Queer Life in Africa's Gay Capital, which illuminates the underground trans women network in apartheid South Africa. Secondly, the emergence of a grassroots African trans archive in the Transgender Studies Quarterly, Trans Archives and Archiving. This one discusses the importance of documenting a community to ensure that its history is not lost. Liesl also contributed Trans Issues in Africa to the Global Encyclopedia of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer History. She now lives in Mexico City and has expanded her consultation work within the Caribbean. When she's not consulting, she enjoys walking in the city, taking photos of street murals and graffiti, especially those with quirky political or resistance messages. And Julius K. Kaggwa is the executive director of Support Initiative for People with Atypical Sex Development, SIPD, in Uganda. It's the first intersex organization in Uganda and the region to particularly address the need for organized medical and psychosocial support, public education, as well as advocacy for human rights protection of intersex children and people. Julius is the author of several media articles on the human rights of intersex children and people in Uganda. He has featured in awareness exhibitions and documentaries on African intersex and gender diversity lived realities, and he has facilitated a number of national, regional, and international workshops on the rights of intersex and gender variant people. In addition, he led the Uganda Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights and Constitutional Law for the first phase of its existence, and was at the forefront of the campaign against the Anti-Homosexuality Act that was tabled in Uganda's parliament in October 2009. He testified before the US Congress and has done extensive advocacy in Uganda, Kenya, the US, South Africa, and Europe on the human rights implications of that act. His passion is to see a world where every human being is treated with dignity and without discrimination on any basis. With that, I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Welcome, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Julius Kaggwa, and this evening I would like to share with you that from as early as the 1980s, sporadic organizing around trans and intersex rights has occurred in Africa, mainly represented by solo activist voices and many small grassroots organizations. This history and significant landmarks have largely remained invisible in academic, research, and movement spaces. So when Liesl and I met 12 years ago in 2008, we committed to not only facilitate movement building for African trans and intersex voices, but also to document and share the history of the transgender and intersex movement in Africa to the extent we were able. And now, in the interest of time, and without further ado, I would like to invite my co-presenter Liesl to take you through the trans and intersex organizing history line of, in Africa, and that to as much as we have been able to document. Liesl.
Hi, everyone. I pronounce she or her. Thank you, Julius, for that generous introduction of our endeavor for a long time to actually try and continue updating the history timeline. And as Julius mentioned, we are looking particularly at the 1980s through to 2014. We feel that that is the time period in history, especially around trans and intersex, that remained silent for quite a long time. And normally in LGBTIQ history, trans and intersex is silenced, with the exception of the so-called scandalized depictions of trans women, many times by either the media, politicians, or religious leaders, and many times used as a guise or a different way to divert attention from whatever else. We also want to acknowledge that several other scholars did publish on the existence of homosexuality, same-sex relations, gender non-conformity, or alternative genders in a pre-colonial time era. However, our timeline is really from the 1980s through to 2014. So therefore, we will capture a lot of the founding of the first organizations, both trans and intersex, and we also speak mostly of English-speaking and Southern and Eastern Africa due to the working experience we had in those regions. So the timeline also comprises of the founding of organizations, as I mentioned, as well as individuals' accomplishments in sport, art, music, and other private domains. We did that mostly because we would like to create a better context of that particular time period, because that most of that time was before internet and also definitely before the influencing of social media. We decided to discontinue our timeline in that period of 2014 because there are a number of trans and intersex organizations and they can continue the work. So we really just wanted to capture a history that is nearly lost. So interestingly, if one look at the founding dates of organizations, it often happened that another political event or something in the continent in the LGBT sector, let's say a regional meeting or so, served as a stimuli or many times a trigger, if one want to call it that way, for the founding of some organizations. That is obviously not that we say it's particularly only because of that reason, but we can almost see it happening in waves. For example, in 2007, there was the first ARC International conference that was for the first time in Africa, and it was hosted in Johannesburg. It was the first time that there was public awareness within the LGBT space in Africa about trans, and kind of like really in 101 way, speaking about terminology, what is the meaning, what is definitions. And shortly after that, a number of leaders came out and for the first time had the language of transgender and came out. So in following that December, very early in January, a trans and intersex and transsexual organization in Uganda was established. Following in February, there was the Coalition of African Lesbians Feminist Institute in Maputo. And that meeting served also as a very prominent turning point in the movement. It was the first time also where trans leaders basically kicked back against lesbians and feminists who say that they want to actually only enter male privilege and therefore want to transition. So that was quite a important meeting. And shortly after that, then in February 2008, RIA, the Rainbow Identity Association in Botswana, was established. The rest of 2008 remained quite a tense space in the continent in LGBT meetings and in the sector. And again, as I said, remember, it was not so usual to just be on Facebook and email and see things. So really, many times the happenings were from meeting to meeting. That's when things happened and when people actually saw each other in person. So in December 2008, Eagle Herc, which is today known as Outright International, and Gender Dynamics, hosted a historical Eastern and Southern Africa transgender and trans and gender identity institute. 16 trans and intersex activists from 9 African countries attended this meeting, week-long meeting in Cape Town. That was in December, so basically still in December, Transbound to Zambia was established, as well as Transgender Educated and Advocacy in Kenya. Going 7 months forward, SIPIT, the organization that Julius is heading, was officially opened, and it existed a while before, but only more informal as a grassroots intersex support group, but now it was formalized. Within that same year, then Sipit and Gender Dynamics formed a partnership with the aim to host an Eastern and Southern Africa Trans and Intersex exchange program, which would run over the length of 3 years. In 2010, Transgender and Intersex Africa was established, and in 2011, they start operating as a full-on organization in its own independent right. In 2011, then also in Uganda, this first meeting of the second year of the exchange program. That meeting was kind of like quite of a watershed. Up until that moment, it was internationally known that in the African continent or African region, the trans movement was led by a trans masculine people, whereas in other regions like Latin America and Asia, the trans movement was most often led by trans feminine people. So that was a watershed meeting, because also in that meeting itself, within the space of the participants, there was a lot of one can call it friction, or ways of people not agreeing anymore with each other, to put it that way. And two trans feminine organizations then came forward, one being known as She, and then also the Transgender Equality in Uganda. We also would like to highlight, and when I say there's a few, like 4 examples, we have an extensive list of events and so, but for the purpose of this presentation, we couldn't make it extremely long. But we wanted to highlight a few individuals' input pre-organizational times in the African region. In 1982, the Phoenix Society in South Africa was established, and that was an underground social group mostly attended by trans women and cross-dressers in the height of apartheid. In 1997, the Ugandan publication titled From Juliet to Julius by Julius Kaggwa, my colleague here, authored a book and published. Um, and that is remarkable, because before that time, any publications in Africa about the whole acronym of LGBTIQ was basically from scholars, international, coming in, did a research, and then published whatever. And as I mentioned in the beginning about the pre-colonial existence or storytelling or whatever. But in this case, this was the first time that somebody in Africa who self-identify published. So that was quite something. Then in 2002, Victor Mukasa is a human rights defender and activist from Uganda, and claimed an identity as a transgender lesbian. It is important here to mention 2 things about that. One is, as we know, even till today, and with the influence of internet, it's moving faster, but terminology do evolve. In those years, when Victor found words and didn't have any description and other means of describing, felt to mention that he claimed both transgender and lesbian. It obviously did spark a lot of controversy, especially in LGBT, lesbian, and feminist circles, because many of those actually almost wanted to push him. You have to choose, you can't be both. And that caused a lot of friction. However, Victor was steadfast at that time that I identify as both. We just want to know that today, in the real time of 2021, Victor do identify as a trans masculine and he and him pronouns. Then in February 2003, the South African Sex Description Act was amended, following or allowing trans and intersex people to obtain their legal documentation according to their chosen gender. This is again something quite remarkable, because in that times, in 2003, South Africa was one of the only few countries in the world that have that act or legal gender marker change without surgery. But unfortunately, as it is, until today, this Department of Home Affairs don't implement the act correctly. We also want to share with you a few snapshots of other individuals. So this is not really organizational, but just to show how things were in that time. In that same year, when the South African government had that remarkable law changed, the Cricket World Cup was hosted in South Africa. And in that Olympic style, how a model go with a banner out in front of each team playing. A Senegalese-born model, Barbara Diop, was chosen to run out for Zimbabwe, or to walk out with the banner for Zimbabwe. Shortly after that, she was outed as a trans person, and number one, she obviously first wanted to deny it. But then, as a consequence of that, the Zimbabwe's president, Robert Mugabe, responded with anger and threatened that he will withdraw the Zimbabwean team from the from the Cricket World Cup. We all know about Caster Semenya, but in this timeline that we present here today, we also wanted to show that there are more athletes in Africa that experience that same dilemma. So Tsotlego Morama from Botswana underwent a gender verification test quite earlier in 2007. Morama was raised as a girl, yet identifying as a boy, and later fathered a child in his late teens. One of the stories that kind of like kept the most attention from us over a long time period was the story of Auntie Victoria. Auntie Victoria was a trans woman who in a younger life had a relationship with somebody from Europe and actually went to Europe. And she then transitioned, came back to Tanzania and started her own life and whatever. But however, while she had a tavern and make her own business and do her own life, she faced a lot of discrimination and stigma and was ridiculed. She then attempted suicide. She committed suicide. Coincidentally, on 17 May, which is actually known as Idaho, somebody took photos of her naked body in the hospital and circulated, and it went viral. And to the point, the scandal was such a big scandal that her family didn't even want to identify the body for the purpose of the burial to continue or to proceed. The morgue of the hospital then had an open house, and people literally lined up to come and look at the body under the guise of identifying her. Eagle Hug and Gender Dynamics supported some activists in Tanzania to eventually got the hospital and the morgue to stop the viewing and to actually put a padlock on the morgue. Her family, however, wanted to bury her in her original form and remove the breast and the surgically affirmed genitalia. With the help of or the support of Eagle Hug, then this was reported in the Tanzanian's 4th periodic review at the United Nations. Auntie Tewonge and her partner Stephen wanted to celebrate their love. A European journalist got wind of this and published it as a gay wedding. That again caused a huge stigma and scandal in Malawi. And following all of the things, they were sentenced in 2010, 6 months later, to 14 years of hard labor. Fortunately, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had a meeting with the president of Malawi, and they were pardoned. And then just 3 other quick highlights as a last point. So in 2010, the first Portuguese language or Lusophone workshop happened about trans awareness in Maputo. And in 2011, Kenya Citizens Bill allowed trans persons to change their particulars on their gender identification. And in 2012, the first trans pride happened in Botswana, organized by RIA. So that is our very, very, very quick snapshot. We have so much more to share, but obviously the time caught us. So both of us will be available for questions afterwards.